Hello, everyone. My name is Bear Wiseman, and I am a fantasy lover. While I live in Finland now, I grew up in Canada as an extremely dedicated geek. In case you don't believe me, this is a picture of my bedroom when I was in high school. I rest my case. And it's clear if you look behind me that nothing has changed in the last 20 years or so. So, in fact, I love fantasy so much that I became a fantasy writer at the wee young age of 13. So, I'd like to talk to you for a little while, at least, about something very dear to my heart: fantasy. You see, the instant my mom gave me windows into worlds outside my own that allowed my imagination to run rampant with possibility, I was hooked. Whether it was the adventures of C.S. Lewis's Narnia series, or the heroic journeys of the Fellowship in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or the wonder of She Who Shall Not Be Named's Harry Potter series, if there was magic or castles, you'd better believe I'd give it a chance. But I must admit that I'm a bit disappointed in what mainstream fantasy has become over the years. I hate to say it, but even though Peter Pan might not have grown up, the stories about kids like him did. The more fantasy I see showing up in popular media, in traumatic grays and blacks, the more I feel like writers have forgotten that fantasy is often at its best when it is fantastical. I mean, look at the definition of fantasy. If I'm fantasizing about something, generally speaking, I'm not dreaming about how rampant war and oppression are still in the year 2025. Indeed, the Oxford definition of fantasy reads, the faculty or activity of imagining impossible or improbable things. To fantasize, ergo, is to imagine the unrealistic or unlikely. But I feel like fantasy worlds and mainstream media these days are focusing too much on the realistic and not enough on the unlikely. So, just to set the scene a little bit, these are a few of my favorite things. I'm not sure about you, but when I was young, the fantasy genre intrigued me largely because it expanded the borders of what could be possible. For example, lizards could have wings, horses could have wings, fairies could have wings. Indeed, I seem to be quite interested in the idea that in some other world, I might be able to fly with much more ease. Other things of great allure included magic. I really liked the idea of potions and spells and runes and charms and mystical things that were understood only by those who dared to delve deep into their world's truth. I also loved quests. The real world had nothing for me in comparison to worlds where someone might spirit you away on some life-changing journey where you would probably save something, even if that something was yourself. And if I couldn't focus on my schoolwork, it was probably because I was thinking about studying somewhere that would teach me how to make potions, or where the history included dragon battles. All of the things that made me fall in love with fantasy were based on the impossible. So why then does our fantasy media these days feel like it's leaning more and more towards the hyper-realistic? When did fantasy stop being about whimsical imagination and start being about grimdark realism? I have a few theories that might have contributed to this shift. First of all, I feel like whimsy fell by the wayside when we fell in love with grimdark. It's popular in online discourse to blame George R. R. Martin for ridiculous things, so I'm gonna get in on this. I want to blame George for doing such a good job of introducing grimdark grit to the world that we accidentally got trapped in a vortex of misery. Of course, spoilers if you don't already know the major plot points regarding the Stark family and his series, but I feel like by now you guys probably know how it goes. So regardless of what we think of the show, it's important to me to recognize that George is brilliant, and everybody loved the show in the beginning for a very good reason. Why? Because he dared to do something that few of us have ever even fantasized about. He eliminated the concept of plot armor. I cannot begin to express how deeply that hooked me as a swords and sorcery loving teenager with undiagnosed ADHD who got extremely bored with regularly used tropes extremely quickly. Until that point in time, the majority of my experience with fantasy came from Disney movies, Tolkien's books, and video games like Final Fantasy, where very few important characters die, at least before the end. This is common in most storytelling. The main character needs to survive long enough to make the ending poignant and dramatic. As such, when Martin quite literally axed the hero of the story in the first book of the series, it was earth-shattering. And then, to double down, he ruined any potential for a redemption arc by killing that character's heir even more brutally. Nobody was immune to death in Westeros. This is where Martin shone as an author of the fantastic. Alongside cool shit like dragons and White Walkers and a very show-don't-tell type of magic, he also gave readers and viewers a new fantasy, which is one where all of the rules get thrown out the window. George's writing personally gave me permission to write whatever the hell I wanted, no matter how far-fetched. Fantasy's potential to exist beyond its own tropes got a lot more fantastical after that, and more exciting to explore by proxy. So, props to George for being a killer storyteller. Pun 100% intended. Now the thing is, I think fantasy needed grimdark to survive in mainstream media. We've had a lot of bad luck with fantasy over the years, so fantasy in television and film has a well-deserved reputation for being really low quality. Game of Thrones brought that quality up, at first, which was really exciting for us lovers of the genre. But the newfound popularity of such dark and gritty worlds occasionally feels like it's lacking something. There was a point in time, after all, when fantasy was almost exclusively associated with unimaginable and mythical things like rainbows, unicorns, dragons, leprechauns, elves, and other such whimsical creatures. And people haven't stopped enjoying those things, as we can see from how much people still delight in My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, or How to Train Your Dragon, or even Shrek. I think it's the goody two-shoes thing that puts most of us off, myself included. I love all the above-mentioned things like fairies and dragons and magic and all of that, but while fantasy once promised that being good-hearted would always bring you victory, this did not reflect reality, thus leaving us jaded and disappointed in predictable, unrealistic fantasy programming that had little to no depth or nuance. So while all the fantasy media we have on offer is on the level of adaptations like The Rings of Power or the Shannara Chronicles, where everyone and everything is really good looking and the stories are either too much or not enough, let's just say I understand why my favorite genre still gets a lot of flack. We're not naive enough as a species to believe in happily ever after anymore. Hard work doesn't equal success the way it used to, so for fantasy to survive at all, it had to get a bit more realistic. Now, grimdark itself is not the problem, but grimdark settings might be, and this is where I think we've overcorrected a little bit. You see, grimdark came into our lives all hot and realistic, and said that fantasy didn't need to be all hearts and rainbows. Fantasy could be cool and badass and nuanced, too. Instead of perfect, handsome princes, we have flawed, moody witchers, and I would be a bold-faced liar if I said I wouldn't take me a Geralt over a Florian any day. We want to fantasize about someone who matches our messiness, not someone who's too perfect to live up to. And this is why George R. R. Martin hit so hard. While shows like Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek covered this in the sci-fi sphere ages ago, fantasy had yet to learn that the good guy doesn't always win. And fantasy certainly hadn't yet learned that a person can be good or bad depending on their motivations and choices. Even more, experiences change us. So emotional stagnation or unrealistic growth or change don't connect with audiences either. So, good old George waltzed in, axe swinging at his main characters, and aired out all of humanity's dirty laundry while he was at it. Finally, all of the heroes were as messy and complicated as we were. And it made for delicious drama. We never knew where someone's bid for control would sweep the story. And here's where I think the post-Game of Thrones fantasy media scene miscalculated a little bit. Because the realism these viewers have been craving is realistic stories and realistic characters, but not necessarily real life. We didn't like Game of Thrones because of the incest and politics. We liked it because it didn't sugarcoat the nasty truth about what people are really like. It showed how dirty everyone is, top to bottom, because we're all people, and class doesn't change that. And that was a message the world was ready to hear, and it's a message that's been told for ages and ages now, but we still clearly need to keep hearing it, because we have not learned. But when all of our media starts to center on how awful humanity is, what room does that leave for hope? Do you think it's more likely that the humble inventor of the trampoline park did so because they were pondering the futility of existence? Or was it because they were fantasizing about how kick-ass it would be if there were trampolines on the walls too? That, my friends, is the power of fantasy. It doesn't just escape reality, it expands what's possible within it. Now, some of the most recent headline-making fantasy series are House of the Dragon, the prequel to Game of Thrones, and The Rings of Power, Amazon's ironic foray into Tolkien's fantasy world. I would like to posit that while House of the Dragon was an all-around higher quality show, it wasn't particularly good fantasy. And while The Rings of Power was an objectively terrible show on most fronts, it ended up being a pretty entertaining fantasy spectacle, if nothing else. How? Because House of the Dragon was so utterly devoid of hope. Fantasy media is inherently escapist per its name. And while meanings evolve over time, sure, House of the Dragon was so utterly dismal, whilst being devoid of cool magic or zombies, that it felt like work to consume. There's nothing to be gained from the experience to take home later to ponder. While it is entertaining to watch the worst of humanity sometimes, it was the sort of series that inherently made my depression worse for draining me of hope, rather than empowering me by making me feel seen. Its only saving grace was the idea of, well, at least I'm not that bad of a person. Meanwhile, The Rings of Power was completely ludicrous. The writing was so magnificently misguided. It was like watching The Room if Tommy Wiseau had been backed by Jeff Bezos. It was fantastical in the sense that I couldn't believe literally anything I was seeing. My fascination over whether it could get any more ridiculous after the first episode kept me hooked. It was utter nonsense, and I regret nothing for having watched it. This is why I think we've focused on the wrong part of grimdark. Grimdark is synonymous with realism, which is one of the best parts of it as a subgenre. But why must we only show realism through the lens of the worst parts of life? Why is everything a cynical deconstruction? Where are Frodo and Sam promising to keep going together no matter what? When the world gets us down, we need ways to cope. This is a place where fantasy could be stepping in to bring us that light in the darkness. But when our fantasy media is also saturated in misery, where do we turn next? It occurred to me that in the earlier times, for I was indeed born in the late 80s and thus am an internet boomer, that what we do on the internet has changed significantly. It used to be a place of unbridled creativity, but nowadays I feel like a huge percentage of the reels I see are about our desperate need for connection and understanding. We probably all know the disturbing psychology behind what getting constantly ranked by likes does to us by now, so I won't get into that. But suffice to say, it wouldn't be a stretch if these things were connected. Surely you remember a common meme template from some years ago. That moment when. I posit that that meme, and others like it, led the way towards the reels we see nowadays, which follow this format. Me doing something. Also me doing something in complete contradiction to the previous thing. I feel like there's a pattern shifting more and more towards a need for connection and validation. The more the real world tries to put us in boxes, the more we need to feel seen for who we really are. We watch some reels, we feel seen for just a moment. It's enough to keep us going, breadcrumbing us through existence. This is, of course, a very complicated subject in general, so I won't go any further into it, but I wonder if our need for connection just so happened to hit us at a time when fantasy media started to show us a dirty mirror, so we were hooked on seeing our lives reflected back at us through the cracks. Now, how this relates to fantasy media, to me there's a clear desperation for relatability, and this is how we fall into the trap that is the miserable, hopeless, grimdark fantasy setting. Feeling seen is such a huge coping mechanism in a continuously more difficult world to survive in. Fantasies are what give us hope when life gets tough. After all, big changes are slow and always face resistance. So when we watch Game of Thrones and think, God, my boss is such a Littlefinger, you feel seen for a moment, especially when online discourse generally agrees that Littlefinger was a total shyster. But when it comes to fantasy, Grimdark has honed in on oppression. It's not a bad thing, because it's important that we draw attention to how terrible these things are. But returning again to House of the Dragon, It didn't seem like that show had anything new to show us. Game of Thrones did that work already. And in Game of Thrones, we dreamed that there would be peace in Westeros and the eternal summer would come someday. In House of the Dragon, we already know that things are gonna get shittier before they get better, and then unfortunately they are gonna get shitty again. So we've returned to fantasy being completely predictable, only now it's hopeless too. That's not what I came to fantasy for. So, grimdark definitely got us halfway there. It got us to feel seen. But what about feeling seen in a way that isn't depressing as hell? What about feeling seen while dreaming of something better? Now here's where fantasy's potential comes to play. I dabbled in 13 stories about young heroes saving worlds that are full of war and misogyny and slavery and colonialism and other forms of oppression. It's easy to write stories like that, because we have infinite inspiration from which to pull in both fiction and real life. But as someone, again, who doesn't tolerate tropes due to their predictability, I realized that I wanted something more human. Something that's easy to relate to without being yet another reflection of our misery. What if I lowered the stakes from global catastrophe to personal catastrophe? What if, instead of making a world that's based on the worst of humanity's history, I made one where people founded civilizations on principles of unity and compassion? Because even the best fantasy series out there might be showing off alternative lifestyles and civilizations and races and species and cultures, but almost none of them show worlds that are inherently peaceful or unified. That's where my interests fixated when I began world building my fantasy series, the Vitmar Chronicles. So, here's where my flagrant self-promotion begins, because I'd like to talk a bit about how I developed as a fantasy writer over the years, and how I started writing worlds that were still fantastical, still deeply realistic and human, while developing settings that weren't inherently oppressive, judgmental, or restrictive. I wanted to explore what life might be like if we were a bit more free to have adventures, and then survive them together. So first things first, I like to fantasize about men being able to express their feelings. One of the most important yet severely under-discussed topics on the rise in online literature is patriarchy and the way it oppresses, surprise, surprise, everyone, including men. After reading a lot about how much these endless, pointless rules abuse us psychologically, I wanted to explore a world without that. I wanted to imagine a world where people didn't need to be performing to other people's standards all the time just to feel accepted and worthwhile. Now, I've been weeding these values out of the story for ages at this point, and I can't promise that I've been perfect at it, but creating a world where people accept one another as fellow humans by default felt like a worthwhile pursuit. Patriarchy sadly oppresses a lot of emotional growth in storylines, because men aren't allowed to have feelings, and women are always told to check their feelings. This is why we still get drawn to grunting, moody men like Geralt in The Witcher. But Geralt is actually a great example of how patriarchy fails men, too. Despite upholding many traditionally masculine standards, like being strong, stoic, skilled, etc., Geralt also feels deeply. He feels love and pain, and the deep sting of knowing that what he does is important, knowing that he has integrity, all while the world at large shows no respect. Geralt was a victim of false accusations and rumor-mongering, and it's rare that he gets notice or the praise that he deserves. He's very much a character that trudges forward, doing his best, surviving only on the validation of knowing that he did what he could in the moment, and that doesn't seem to get him very far in the long run. I think Geralt makes pretty much all of us feel seen sometimes. So Geralt, along with the tearful gentlemen in Tolkien's Fellowship, were solid inspirations for men with feelings. Put them in a world where they were allowed to be both manly and emotional? Let's just say the process itself brings me a lot of joy. So what if fantasy didn't just give us pain and perseverance, though? What if it helped us imagine healing, too? That became the heart of the journey I wanted to create for my characters, Gabriel and Kaldor Vitmar, when I began writing the Vitmar Chronicles. Rather than covering a single quest or a sweeping revolution, their stories explore life when the stakes are at the level of individual challenges rather than societal. And just because the level of oppression is low doesn't mean there is no loss or conflict. In fact, Exploring loss and conflict without systems of oppression became one of the most compelling reasons to write in this world. So to tell you a little bit about the Vitmar Chronicles, it was born from a conversation between myself and a fellow metalhead fantasy writing friend based on a common prompt. What if we were characters in a fantasy story? What would our stories be like? I have to credit this old friend because that conversation was one of those ones that sticks with you for months until something happens. You see, I'd expected him to be giving me some sort of blustering tale of grand heroism. Instead, I was presented with a heart-wrenching and brutally human tale of deep love and immense grief. But what stuck with me too was the thought that this story could exist without the need for life-altering cataclysms to be raging in the background. He didn't frame the story in a world that was facing problems of its own. Love does indeed blossom without mortal danger creating desperation. One person could be grieving life-altering loss while their neighbor goes about their day. Just like real life. This concept drew my attention to the way fantasy characters often go through harrowing, traumatic experiences and tend to just move past them like it's no big. There's no emotional aftermath. Like that time Jon Snow died. So I started thinking about the concept of a hero. What did it mean to be a hero in the world that doesn't have societal conflict? Shortly, I honed in on a new idea. You don't need to save the world to be the hero of your own story. With this fresh moral in mind, I thus abandoned my massive Final Fantasy knockoff series and dedicated myself entirely to crafting a saga that spanned a generation, following the real lives of these two brothers as they grew up in a world that was kind but not without struggle. I wanted the story to show the potential within us to form beautiful bonds, and to show how those bonds shift and evolve as time goes on. If anyone dares to read this chronicle, I hope it leaves them wondering, does real life need to be this tough? What sort of life would we be willing to fight for if we believed a better world was possible? Now, I would never claim to be an expert on feminism or patriarchy, but I do think I got enough of a grasp to start shaping a world built on emotional equality. As such, I'm going to do a quick reading of a scene from the Vitmar Chronicles Volume 2, which is coming out on August 22nd. Shameless plug. The first version is what I call the patriarchy edition that has been run through the grimdark filter, where tenderness is weakness, every conversation is a dominance contest, and emotional nuance goes straight out the window. My goal here is to draw attention to how masculine intimacy is executed with regard to vulnerability after one of the main characters has a panic attack. Gabriel? Host said you came running up here. You alright? Gabriel unlocked the door in silence. Kaldor stepped in, brows furrowed, warrior's arms crossed tightly across his chest. You look awful. What happened? Something happened in the town center, Gabriel muttered. I met someone and felt something weird. Like at the enchantry, only worse. I panicked and left. Kaldor blinked at him. You ran away? From a girl? Gabriel winced and sat down heavily on the floor. I didn't know what else to do. It felt wrong. Intense. Kaldor sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. Okay, so you saw a girl and panicked. That's not a crisis. You're just infatuated. Please go talk to her, like a normal person. Who was she? I don't even remember much. Just her eyes, her hair. I think she might be Fae or something. Kaldor snorted derisively. Oh, come on. Now she's a magical threat because she's exotic? That's not how this works. The likelihood of getting attacked by Maita twice is astronomically low, so please move on. I'm serious, Gabriel snapped, but his voice cracked. There's something off about her. Yeah, well, maybe you need to get a grip. You're acting like a spooked deer. Gabriel looked down at his hands, still shaking. Kaldor hesitated. Look, it's nothing. You're weak in the knees for a pretty girl, just like the rest of us. If you're really that worried, I'll come with you. But you can't keep spiraling every time you feel something. A knock at the door interrupted them. Gabriel Vitmar, you have a visitor. Kaldor raised an eyebrow and smirked. And she came to you. Gabriel paled. Don't make this into something it's not. Kaldor laughed. Get up, splash some water on your face, and stop acting like the world's ending. I don't know if I can. You can, Kaldor said flatly. Go. Now, I'm not sure how you feel about that, but personally, I didn't get the feeling that Kaldor did much to help. So, here's my fantasy of a world where emotional intimacy is the default and vulnerability is not scorned but supported. This is the same scene as it is actually written in Volume 2. Gabriel? The host said you came running up here in a panic. Is everything all right? Can I come in? Come in, Gabriel replied and got to his feet to unlock the door. Kaldor entered, looking a bit frazzled. What's going on? Is everything all right? He repeated, Warrior's arms open in front of him. No. Something happened in the town center, Gabriel stammered. I met someone. I felt, like at the enchantry, but so much stronger when I looked in her eyes. I didn't jump to any conclusions this time. I just panicked. And I left. He slumped to the floor, leaning against the bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling. Okay, Kaldor said, immediately understanding. Something new. Something you haven't faced before. It's okay, we'll figure this out together. I'm doing, where I can only imagine the worst possible scenario. I'm convinced she's some sort of horrible fey monster, but I know the odds of that are low, so I need you to tell me what she really is. He took a deep breath and failed to steady his shaking hands. Kaldor sat down next to Gabriel and put his arm around his elder brother. Keep breathing. What else do you remember about her? Did you notice anything strange? Anything that stood out? I don't remember. Gabriel frowned, frustrated with himself. She was shorter than me by a fair bit. Almond white hair. I guess that's unusual. But everything else is a blur. The intense sensation from her eyes was so strong that I just fled. Well, perhaps the sensible solution would be to find her and talk to her, Kaldor offered gently. Then we can at least see what we're up against. Gabriel inhaled sharply and nodded. You're probably right, though I don't like the idea. But how would we even find her? Kaldor was about to reply when a knock came at the door. Gabriel Vitmar, you have a visitor. Gabriel froze. Kaldor snapped his gaze back to his brother. No, he said, cutting Gabriel off before he could speak. Nope, absolutely no. Extremely no. This is proof of exactly nothing. Gabriel lowered his protesting hand. Nothing at all. Don't jump to conclusions. There could be a perfectly reasonable explanation. He turned his head to the door and called out, Thank you, we'll be right down. Kaldor, Gabriel started. Breathe, Kaldor said, and Gabriel obliged, exhaling slowly. I'll be with you. You're not going to be murdered in a smoke room lobby today. You're right, Gabriel said through several long breaths. All right, let's go. Personally, I like this scene better. It did take a long time to eradicate the judgment, dismissal, and defensiveness, but I'm pretty satisfied with how it plays out overall, with two men communicating and working together to get through a situation. This tonal shift in communication then cascaded into other aspects of the world building where I could reform anything. So, in the world of Elinica, which is the world from the Vitmar Chronicles, magic is the equivalent of technology that already almost ended the world. One of the other big changes I made relates to where magic comes from. To give credit where due once more, I have to give a shout out to my partner. I asked him aeons ago what could be a source of magic that isn't a standard trope. He offered the idea that magic could come from the multiverse. This piqued my interest once again. Multiverses are no new concept to us geeks, but I hadn't encountered them as a source of magic before. They were a setting, sure, but not a fuel. This gave me a vast sandbox to play in, with no tropes to guide my creativity. In Elinica, multiversal magic is basically a sustainable, unlimited energy source. But learning to use it is not unlike joining the military while simultaneously getting a PhD in the sciences. Magic is limitless in its possibilities, but volatile to experiment with. Magic shapes their tools, their travels, their conflicts, their laws, and is thus heavily regulated and protected by people with deep insight into what's at stake. A lot of the world history of Elinica comes from pondering the sort of effect this magic would have on the world and its people. There's so many practicalities that one could use magic for, like a rune that puts a wind in your ship's sails on a still day. I also started to wonder what the people who abused that sort of power would look like. If these people went to war, what would be at stake? Probably the whole fabric of reality. Then I started to fantasize about someone realizing they made a cosmic mistake, like fracturing the fabric of reality. I further fantasized about the type of person who would admit to making a mistake on that level. What if they even spearheaded the effort to fix what they had done? The more I stripped oppression from society, and the less shame and fear acted as driving forces, the more characters were able to cut through the emotional noise and find productive solutions to life's unexpected twists. So, I started making societies that didn't totally suck. I didn't know anything about political theory when I started writing the Vitmar Chronicles, but over the years I learned enough about economies failing, governments harming their people, and cycles of injustice repeating that I began to just work backwards from what not to do. I wanted my civilizations to be founded on an active desire to right some wrongs. For that, these people needed to have a good reason to start over. Perhaps because someone had recently fractured reality. New societies were thus founded on generational trauma caused by a familiar sort of real-world oppression and a resulting desire to start fresh after a calamity provided an opportunity. Here are some settings that popped up in my world building. Isidore, the main setting, is stewarded by the patron of the realm, someone who, much like Scott Lynch's Gentlemen Bastards, dedicates their life to learning as much about others as possible. Only in this case, it's for the sake of serving people, not crafting elaborate cons. Their job is to understand the needs of the community and advocate accordingly. The focus is on ensuring basic needs are met, like housing, food, and joy. Issues are brought to tribunals and discussed with experts and are addressed through a lens of potential benefit versus harm. The Merchantiles are a heavily trade-oriented society with strong guilds and deep mutual respect for one another's craft. It's one of the more indulgent cultures in this new world. And Macleria is a settlement on a well-fortified island that didn't have much in the way of resources. Thus, the new arrivals appropriated a lush neighboring island to harvest food, wood, and so on. Teresia was formed after Maclerian laborers and a group of castaways rebelled against Macleria's rule and joined forces with the disturbed local nature spirits. Their society is completely communal due to constant invasion. And then the last example I'll share at this point is Nordval, the largest of the new societies, with multiple clans living integrated lives with animal familiars, treating one another collaboratively and with mutual respect. Several neutral spaces are scattered throughout, along with a few anarchic regions, and there's no dominant hierarchy. Each new society was an opportunity to explore what would happen if communities were served by their leaders and not controlled. So, since we're in the Nordics and everyone here clearly likes heavy metal, let me quickly reference a song from Marco Hietala, who once sang and played bass in a really small unknown band that no one's ever heard of called Nightwish. The song is called Two Soldiers, and I'm sure to no one's surprise, it's a song about war. In every chorus, the line sings, "War will never change, and this is who we are." It's an incredibly melancholy song about how mankind just never learns. That is, up until the end, when the lyric changes the last time they sing it. All we have are dreams, and dreams can take you far. This is the key idea behind this whole talk. It's great to relate to one another. It's the best to connect. And if what we're doing is commiserating with the struggles of life to help us survive it, then we need to do just that. But I personally would also like to see the world start thriving. I don't want to need to watch 400. You got this, girl, and here's what you need to know about this mental health disorder or that chronic ailment, and calling out this type of societal oppression or current war. All these reels, I don't want to watch hundreds of them every day just to feel seen and cared for. I just want people to feel seen and cared for. But if the only things we ever take in are miserable reflections of our lives, we're gonna forget to dream of something better. This is why I think it's important for us fantasy writers to remember to keep dreaming about something that feels impossible, like worlds that are worth fantasizing about. As such, for you creative types out there, I want to throw out a little challenge. But before I do that, I want to introduce you to someone that I don't know, but I think you should pay attention to nevertheless. This is Amy McNee. She's a writer, and her recent release is a book called We Need Your Art. If you go follow Amy on her socials, and you should because her message is really important, she talks a lot about how important it is to make art no matter what, even especially if it's bad. Why? Because the world needs hope, and that's what art and fantasy are. If you're worried that you suck, may I please draw your attention back to Tommy Wiseau. If you've got heart and love what you're doing, people respond anyway, regardless of how technically good it is. And for those of you who are taking up arms in the anti-AI war, this is your reason to start writing or drawing or whatever. Now, I'm not going to tell you to write or create something hopeful or beautiful or magical. I'm going to tell you to write what's inside that needs to come out. But, as someone who once believed that they would spend their entire lives polishing a 13-series story that borrowed way too much from my inspirations, I assure you that a creative mind garden will flourish when tended with care. I thought I had only one idea for a story for many years. Turns out I have more ideas than I know what to do with. And it's not just me. I've seen it happen to others around me. My friend Kathy wrote a book called Aphrodite Rising. She released it earlier this year. It's so cool. It's a beautiful story of love and grief in a fantasy setting. And she had such a great time writing that now she's writing more, and I couldn't be more enthusiastic. I loved Aphrodite Rising. So if you love fantasy, if you dream about other worlds, if you find yourself mapping out kingdoms in the margins of your notebooks, I challenge you to fantasize about something better and throw it out into the world. Write a story, invent a culture, draw a map, but don't just limit yourself to highlighting a problem. See if you can solve it while you're at it. Because maybe, just maybe, if enough of us do that, we'll find the inspiration to start making some of these fantasies come true. Thank you so much for watching this. This is the talk that I did at Archipelacon in June 2025. I'm hoping to bring this to other conventions, so if you see me out there, come say hi. I'd love to hear what you think of all of this. Stay balanced, my friends.